Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2024 Great Decisions Speaker Series, an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association, co-sponsored by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and UMSL Global, the International Office of the University of Missouri, St. Louis. On behalf of our co-sponsors, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. The World Affairs Council of St. Louis is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that connects the citizens of the St. Louis region to the world. It's their 75th anniversary this year, so help them celebrate by becoming a member today and support their many programs devoted to promoting understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. My name is Stephen Bagwell. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and I'll be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome Tom Morris to the Great Decision Speaker Series. Tom worked for USAID for 30 years, including 17 years living and working overseas. Including several years in Indonesia, where he represented USAID's $400 million program in official development assistance to the Indonesian government and the Aceh province. He supervised programs in road construction, housing, and business revitalization after a devastating tsunami, and his work led to over 1,000 houses being built, among many other different infrastructure projects. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. I won't tell you what year. And we're proud to welcome him back to the virtual campus for the Great Decision Speaker Series on Understanding Indonesia. Tom, with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to Bob and his team for organizing this. And thanks to UMSL in general for leading this. And particularly thank you to the World Affairs Council for being a sponsor of this. Just to add to what Stephen said, I graduated from UMSL in 1977, so you can do the math. After I left, I got my BA from UMSL, and then I went on and joined the Peace Corps, and I had the international bug in me, and spent a couple of years in Latin America, and came back and ended up moving to Washington, D.C., going to graduate school, and I eventually settled on a job with the United States Agency for International Development. That's the arm of the State Department that manages foreign assistance. And I worked there for almost exactly 30 years. I retired at the end of 2019. So I've been retired now for almost 5 years, and been involved with UMSL for a while in a variety of capacities. And I've been back to campus a few times, talked to some of Stephen's students and really enjoyed it, and looking for future opportunities to come back and do stuff on campus. But this is a really good second best option. And basically the technology works for me, and I think it works for you folks too, because I got a relatively straightforward presentation here on my work in Indonesia. And I was thinking about it, it's more of a story. It's not some classic PowerPoint presentation with a lot of numbers and this and that. It's a story of U.S. foreign policy, and it's a success story. And the success wasn't all my doing. I was lucky enough to be part of it, but it was a success story based on timely leadership in the foreign affairs community within the U.S. government, it's a timely these days, as you know, we struggle almost every day on implementing foreign policy. So here's Indonesia. That's where I spent 3 years working in response to the tsunami. And give you a little bit of background, because Indonesia it's a fascinating country. And there are over 17,000 islands. I think probably half of them are uninhabited. But it's 17,000 islands. It's a population of 280 million people spread around, not evenly. They're the fourth most populous country in the world. And of that 280 million, 155 million live on the island of Java, which is on the bottom left of this chart. Java is about the same size as Illinois, which has 13 million people. So it's very, very densely populated. And that kind of underscores the fact that the population of Indonesia is not spread out evenly. It's vast amounts of forest and underpopulated areas, and then some major very densely populated areas. So that's worth knowing. Many of you may know that Indonesia was a Dutch colony before it was an independent country, and it was referred to as the Dutch East Indies for many years. There was a Dutch colony up until 1941, at which point the Dutch were thrown out and the Japanese moved in. Japanese, it was the Second World War. Japan invaded Indonesia and took control. Japan occupied Indonesia until 1949, when Indonesia became independent. Indonesia, in the United States, we like to refer to it as the largest Muslim majority country in the world, which it is. By far, most of the population is Muslim. The Indonesians really don't like to be referred to as their country as the largest Muslim majority country, even though they acknowledge the fact that it's true and they're not ashamed of it. But they don't really like the way we view them in that regard. But it's not a big deal, but it always kind of bugs them. And it's also the third largest democracy in the world. And they've had some bumps on democracy. We're hopeful, but it's a work in progress. After the country became independent, it's worth noting that it's had a long history of rule by strongmen. There was the Sukarno dictatorship lasted until the end of World War II, until 1967. He was overthrown by Suharto, who was the dictator for 30 years, from 68 to 98. And then there were three short presidencies, and when they started getting their act together and having democratically elected government. And there was a new president inaugurated on October 20th, 2004, a former military guy, and who wanted to reform the country. And it's worth noting that he took office on October 20th, 2004, and the tsunami hit on December 26, 2004. So Indonesia has a long history of rule by you can call them dictators or strongmen, because it's always been a real challenge to hold this country together. As I said, it's an archipelago of 17,000 islands, and with dispersed all sorts of ethnic populations scattered around. So it's always been tough to hold it together. Moving on to the topic at hand, after a little bit of background on Indonesia, here is where the tsunami hit. What you're seeing here is Aceh province. It's at the northwestern tip of the island of Sumatra, which is that big island that goes from top left down to bottom right. It's the largest island in Indonesia, and you can see it's sitting right next to the country of Malaysia. This was ground zero for the tsunami. It was 9:30 in the morning on December 26th, the day after Christmas in 2004. There was a 9.2 magnitude earthquake off the west coast of Sumatra, about 100 miles away. And there were two tectonic plates that were splitting apart. One was going up, the other one was going down, in simple term. And that caused a massive displacement of the earth and the water above it. And that led to the tsunami. It was a tsunami, but there were actually 6 surges recorded in Aceh and along the 300-mile coast of the northern end of the island. Some of them reached 500 miles an hour coming in at, and 90 feet high. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And roughly 170,000 Indonesians were killed. Most of them swept out into the Indian Ocean, never to be seen again. And most of them here died in Aceh province, this green tip of the island, which was pretty densely populated at the time and still is. It's worth noting that the tsunami caused the death of approximately almost 250,000 people, about 240,000 throughout the Indian Ocean, because it spread all the way from here westward across the Indian Ocean to India, Sri Lanka, up and down, and even as far west as the coast of Africa. the other side of the Indian Ocean. But far and away, the majority of the people killed, the vast majority, were Indonesians, and nearly all of them were from Aceh. So that's where Aceh sits. Here's a picture of the Grand Mosque in Aceh. Worth noting that because that's a little bit of background on this presentation. It's worth knowing that the province of Aceh was settled in the 13th century by a very conservative sect of Islam, and they pretty much wanted to be left alone. The population was about 5.2 million, and they were in the midst of an ongoing civil war for their independence. As I said earlier, Indonesia is a country rife with different nationalities, different ethnicities throughout, spread around through 17,000 islands. So that's why they like to have strong presidents to try and hold the country together. And so they were battling with the central government for almost 3 decades. And there was a real significant split. The people in Aceh, the Achenese, did not trust their government in Jakarta, and they felt, totally isolated and on their own. So when the tsunami hit, the good news is that both sides were basically realized they had to make peace. And the good news is that there was a newly elected president, as I said earlier, who really, even before the tsunami, he was intent on resolving this conflict. And he worked night and day to do that, particularly after the tsunami hit. And that was President Yudhoyono, who was in power for a number of years after the tsunami. Relatively successful president. The bottom line is this was a real opportunity for U.S. leadership to come to bear and help build back this country, this province. And so here is the city of downtown Banda Aceh, the capital of Aceh before the tsunami. And here is basically what it looked like afterwards. You can see it was pretty much flattened. Yeah, here is a residential area that was no longer residential. This, you can see the water still standing. This was immediately after the tsunami. The U.S. response, the U.S. leadership was immediate. When there's an emergency or a disaster like this throughout the world, the United States government, and particularly the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, is immediately prepared to respond. There was a humanitarian response of about $48 million, which immediately started flying in temporary housing, potable water, food, and also just helping to clean up the mess, which was enormous, as you can see here. Here's a neighborhood. This used to be kind of middle and upper middle class housing, pretty much completely flattened. What the U.S. also did was we sent the United States naval ship, the USNS Mercy, which is a naval hospital ship. It goes around the world treating, soldiers, sailors who need help. We sent that immediately to Indonesia, and they received it with open arms. And the United States military even sent an aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, to Indonesia to help with a number of different things the U.S. military was involved in. And this was really, really striking because Indonesia was always a non-aligned country, and they welcomed the USS, an American aircraft carrier, into their ports with open arms. So that is the end of that story. And this was an enormous ship that it's sitting on, it was out at sea before the tsunami hit. And now it's sitting on land. It was about 2 miles inland. And the force of the tsunami lifted up this ship, moved it 2 miles inland, where it, for all I know, it's still there. So just a little photo to give you a sense of what we were dealing with. Now we're basically getting into the high-level Indonesian leadership that I worked with. I arrived in July of 2005, a few months after the tsunami, when we were moving into the phase of reconstruction, because all of our immediate relief had pretty much been used up. And now we were figuring out what to do for long-term reconstruction. And the gentleman in this photo was my primary counterpart in Indonesia. His name was Kuntoro, and he was a very honest political leader and bureaucrat in a country that was noted for its massive corruption and graft. And there was enormous pressure to put him in charge of this, because there was $14 billion coming in to help reconstruct the province of Aceh from all international donors. The US, we provided another 410 million on top of our initial contribution. And it was a real opportunity, once again, for US leadership, because this gentleman, Kuntoro, not only was he honest, but he liked the United States. He got his master's degree, MS in engineering from Stanford, and United States Agency for International Development paid for it. So he kind of liked America, and he liked United States government, USAID. And so he was a great counterpart. And the Indonesians realized they needed to put somebody in charge with integrity. As I said, just to back up a little bit, another example of the US leadership at this point was when our program was starting, right about now when I arrived. Just before that, President George W. Bush, president at the time, he realized the enormity of what was happening, and he sent his two representatives to Indonesia to tell the Indonesians that we were on their side. And these two representatives were his father, President George Herbert Walker Bush, and his father's successor, President Bill Clinton. So Bush and Clinton came in February 2005 to Indonesia, basically to let them know that, we're there to help, and we want to help reconstruct Aceh, and, with any luck, help bring peace to the area. Let's see, moving on. Yeah, here, that's me, the one with the sunglasses. And this was an example of our work on housing. I was standing there at a housing project with my Indonesian counterpart, who was in charge of housing construction. And housing construction, as you can imagine, was the primary need, because people who survived, their houses were gone. And there was a massive need for housing. And that was the highest priority of the construction. So we took a lead role in housing. And I had a well-staffed office. I spent most of my time up in Aceh and managing projects and working with folks like this gentleman. Here's an example of the USAID funding, USAID funded houses that we provided. These were well designed, well built, with community involvement, and they took a little bit of time to get up, but they were well worth it. The problem is that there was a lot of organizations that were building too quickly, not planning it, and having a lot of pushback on the part of the folks in Aceh. USAID did it slower. Here's me again, and the guy on my left, the guy with the white shirt and his head turned. He was an urban planning specialist from Philadelphia who was our housing advisor, and he basically helped do it right for building back houses instead of slapping things up overnight. This gentleman's name was Ernie. He was involved with providing assistance to plan the housing construction to the extent possible for all of Aceh province, but certainly for where USAID was going to be working. And here's an example of his work. This looks like a hodgepodge, it looks like a mess, but basically this was something that was produced at a planning session where his team went out to the communities and worked with the communities to plan the rebuilding of their communities. Rather than just slapping up houses, they wanted a community reconstruction. They wanted to feel, some ownership. They just didn't want a new house to move into. And so this was an example of the housing planning that was done. Here is some housing that was based on community planning. You know, it's well planned. It's in a community, and you know they got streets, and it has some form. There were 80,000 houses that were required immediately to be built to get folks a place to live rather than in a tent. And so, but at the same time, rather than putting these things up overnight, they needed community planning, and that's where USAID came in and our advisors. So this is a good example of U.S. leadership that garnered a lot of support on the part of the Indonesians, particularly the people in Aceh, because they trusted us. The people in Aceh, the Indonesians in Aceh who lived there, did not trust their own government, which was all people from Java, who they generally hated because they've been fighting with them for 28 years. Just to sum up, the housing sector is a good metaphor for, a good example, a good story about U.S. Leadership. You know, we were battling way too much money coming in, and this was money that wanted immediate results in housing, something we can't do. We were battling a history of corruption. You know, when you're giving out construction contracts, what a perfect opportunity to skim off a bunch of money and get rich. So we had our advisors and systems in place to avoid that. And there was weak oversight. We had people who went out and monitored the construction of these houses, and once they were built, ensured that people were living there. And as I indicated earlier, there was very little planning in a lot of the work that was done in Aceh, except for what we funded. We ensured that there was a lot of planning. Here's an example of kind of some of the real crap, some of the real bad housing that's going up. It's they're just slapping this together. This is non-USAID funded housing, and you can see basically just a bunch of bricks getting stacked on top of each other. Virtually no reinforcement bars or rebar, as they call it. And this is ground zero in an earthquake zone, as we just found out in the tsunami. And they're building back houses without any reinforcement bar. Now that's a recipe for further trouble. So this was an example of houses being slapped together real quickly, and probably at a very high cost. And for all we knew, somebody could easily have been skimming off money from the top of that. So that kind of sums up the housing part. Now, there was, for about 150 miles up and down the coast of Sumatra from Aceh, the coast was destroyed. And there was a real need to link the Aceh community with the rest of Sumatra. And that's where the US came in. And nobody else wanted to do it, none of the other donors. But my boss's boss, I guess, decided that we were going to build a highway up and down the coast, 130 miles. And here's me standing at a place where the bridge was wiped out along the coast. So there was a lot of transport going up and down the coast, and now it's no longer possible. So the U.S. volunteered to allocate the funds to do the coastal highway construction, the Aceh Highway. It's about 140 miles, and it was built at international standards, to international standards with international supervision. But we used local construction, and so the construction firms in Indonesia got the opportunity to rebuild their own country. It was a really challenging project. A lot of physical and dicey political and physical environment that we had to deal with. The bottom line is this was a couple $100 million project, and it was a project that was hard. It was really hard, and I don't really claim to have much responsibility for it because I wasn't directly working on the highway project. I was just kind of overseeing it from above. I was doing everything else basically. But it was a good example of the highest level of U.S. leadership coming and say, we're going to do this because it's hard. So here's another photo. This was the highway went along the coast, and then the coast disappeared. So here's an example of some coastal destruction. And, it was I was there for 3 years. It was another 2 years before the highway was finished. But when it was finally finished, looked pretty good. And it was built to international standards, and it's still in use, and pretty much of a success story. So basically, it's an example of, the road is on the mend, and the entire province of Aceh is on the mend. And, this is the rice paddies. You can see that the rice production is back. And the road construction basically enabled the fishing industry to get back. That was a driver in their economy, is fishing. And, a lot of the people who were killed on that morning were fishermen, were out to sea, and they never came back. So the fishing industry was key. That got restarted. And basically, oh yeah, we worked in the coffee sector. For those of you who like Sumatra coffee, this is where it's from. And we help regenerate the coffee production in the interior of the island, which was not affected by the tsunami because it was in the highlands. But that was a key driver of the economy. And so the United States government supported the coffee sector. And actually, we even worked with Starbucks on that. So they made a big investment there, and gone over pretty well. So basically, that's the story. Best wishes for the future of Aceh. I still haven't been back there yet. It's been almost 20 years. So now that I'm retired and traveling more, my wife and I hope to get back there. But the long-term impact of this is more than just the story, but it's a good example of what we can do when we put our mind to it. And obviously, if you have the money, but the need was so great. One of the things I mentioned earlier was that, they had a civil war, and the tsunami was instrumental in bringing peace accords to Aceh province. And the United States government was involved in that. We sent advisors, and we helped them work through the minutia of reaching a peace accord. Indonesia, for its part, remains a key, U.S. partner in the Asian Pacific. Let's see what else. The U.S. image, of course, is really strengthened as a result of this, because the Indonesians, for the most part, they're very accepting of Americans, and they like America, and it's a role model. So, without getting into all the geopolitical issues in the region, they're kind of looking at China as a country that is out there and is interested in courting Indonesia. So Indonesia really doesn't want to get involved in the whole U.S.-China disagreement, but for their part, they tend to vote with their feet and their hearts toward America. So let's see. One of the things I like to mention is, why is all this important? Obviously, we built the country, or not the country, but the province of Aceh. And it's a good example of the fact that this is a very conservative brand of Islam, which is very pro-American. And they just wanted to be left alone. They fought a civil war, they lost. The people in Aceh didn't trust their government. The United States came in and was viewed as a fair mediator and to our success. And we had a president of Indonesia who wanted to turn things around, and the United States leadership, as well as other countries, helped him to do that. Nowadays, there's a new president who will be inaugurated in October 20th, president of Indonesia. He's another strong man. Surprise, surprise. His name is Subianto, and he's got deep links to the previous dictatorship. He's married to the daughter of the former president, Suharto. He was involved in some of the military campaigns that were accused of human rights violations over the years, because, as I said, Indonesia is a country that has various outlying parts that are a lot of times fighting for their own independence, or they're just rebels. And so there was there was the Timor crisis. There was one in Papua where people were wanted their independence, and that was repressed. So he was involved in repressing it. So the question is he going to be another, good strong man or a bad strong man now moving forward? As I mentioned, a final note on China, just because a lot of people tend to be interested in the China perspective. But the Chinese economy is floundering, and it doesn't provide a lot of opportunity for the Indonesians. The Chinese economy is sinking. Their foreign outreach, their assistance program, which is called the Belt Road Initiative, really hasn't gone very far. So it's a real opportunity for the U.S. to stay engaged and to stay engaged, particularly on critical issues. And those critical issues, climate change is a big one. I mean, Indonesia is a country rich in protected, or what should be protected areas, some of the jungles, etc. Also, the question of human rights is important, and Indonesia is doing its best to address that throughout the country, notwithstanding the fact that they got a lot of outlying provinces that maybe not on board. They're doing a pretty good job. And then the issue of migration. Oh yeah, I'll end. Speaking of China, the U.S. government had hoped to engage the Indonesians and a lot of the East Asians on this Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was about 5 or 6 years ago at the end of the Obama presidency. This was on the table, and it was going to basically build partnerships throughout all of Asia, and that was nixed by President Trump. And so that was an opportunity to form an alliance with a lot of like-minded countries throughout East Asia. I'm not sure where that's at, but it's probably still in twinkle in somebody's eye. I don't know if it's going to go forward again, but that was something that was hopeful, and that what the U.S. was doing at the time. I think I've talked long enough. So how's that sound, Stephen?
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. So I've got a couple questions, and we've already got one from the audience. So we'll dive right in. I'll start with Karen Gladback's question from the audience. Can you talk a little bit about how the many donor countries work together to rebuild the community and the houses? Did you have to abide by international housing standards like you did for the highways? How did you sort of work through the logistics of that sort of big international collaboration?
Good question. I mean, it was pretty messy initially, but a lot of systems were set up and put in place. And actually, it worked out better than I had envisioned upon arrival. And that was because of the leadership of the gentleman I showed in the slide, whose name was Kuntoro, the former minister of Indonesia, he was put in charge of Aceh reconstruction. And basically, he was firm, fair, and hardworking, and he commanded a lot of respect. And he didn't like a lot of playing around. So, there were a lot. There's typically turf battles, and one donor wants to do this, one donor wants to do that. He didn't put up with any of that, and he hired good people and saw to it that he supported them, and it worked out pretty well. So each of us knew our role, and there was massive meetings constantly coordinating, but it worked out pretty well in the scheme of things. And that was basically due to the leadership, not of the U.S. or donors, but of the Indonesians. Of course, we pressured them to appoint this gentleman. So that worked out pretty well. And then for road construction, we built it basically to U.S. standards. So that was, they got a Cadillac out of this, and most of their roads were nowhere near this nice. So when they learned that it was being built to U.S. standards, with nice shoulders and all that good stuff, that they were happy about that. And then the housing issue was that was tricky because there really were no standards in Aceh. I mean, there was kind of your typical house, but it was incumbent upon each of the donors who were financing the reconstruction to ensure that it satisfied the local community and obviously Indonesian law. And as I indicated earlier, a lot of these builders did not do that. And I was there for 3 years, and my final year, I used to drive through communities where there were houses built that were rotting, uninhabited for a year. Nobody moved into the damn things. So the Yachinis voted with their feet, and they stayed away from the junky construction, and went with the good stuff, or went out on their own. So I guess that's enough about that.
Thanks, Tom. I have another question from Larry Taylor in the audience. He says he recalls that US Indo had an ACE program. Can you think of do you remember any other American organizations that participated in the support for ACE? Public, private, NGOs, etc.
I mean, CARE and World Vision and all these relief organizations that after the tsunami, they were flooded with money. And so they had their own money, and they came down there, with tons of money. Any Red Cross, just the whole gamut of them, they all had money, and they all wanted to do something, big and important. But that got a little crazy because some of them weren't real organized. But after the tsunami, people voted with their pocketbooks and gave a lot of money to organizations. And most of them worked out pretty well, but some didn't. But that was a real task because you had all these organizations with private money and doing things, which is fine, but it just getting it to jive with what the Indonesians want and what the other countries want. So, but yeah, any organization that worked in humanitarian assistance at all got money to work in ACE. So that was one of the biggest challenges, was just coordinating all of that. And that's where the Indonesians came in and basically said, you're doing this, you're doing that, go here, go there. So that eliminated a lot of the turf battles, which that I didn't have to really get into in a big way at all. So
Thank you. I've got a couple questions myself. I'm going to abuse my privilege as moderator to get through some of those. I don't know if you've seen the news. Unfortunately, not great news. A volcano has been erupting 5 times in the last basically 2 or 3 days. They're in Indonesia. They've had to evacuate part of one of the islands. Do you think that they have continued to invest in infrastructure? Have there been major infrastructural improvements that would mitigate damage from a potential tsunami? How do you see like sort of like long-term prospects based on your time there?
I think long-term, they're pretty good because Indonesians are very resilient people, and they demonstrated it in the tsunami. And also they've learned a good lesson. Problem is, lessons learned after 20 years now and 30, 40 years, they tend to be forgotten or ignored. So, and Indonesia is the only country in the world that doesn't learn from its past. But the problem is that one of the problems is Indonesia sits in a volcano area, and it's called the Ring of Fire. And it's the Ring of Fire circles the Pacific Ocean, all the way from the west coast of the United States up to Alaska and the Aleutians, and then down the coast of Asia, and all the way down to Indonesia. And it's seismically very unstable, so you have a lot of earthquakes. And if you have a lot of earthquakes in the ocean, you have tsunamis. And there's a lot of volcanoes. And the population of Indonesia, it's not growing as much as it used to. I think they're just above replacement fertility a bit. But the population is growing, arable land. And so that's a real issue. And then there's a lot of effort to turn land into agriculture, which basically is bad for climate change and bad for the soil, and inevitably. But there are a lot of poor people who are looking for places to farm. So that's an issue. Yeah, they're doing, for where they're living, they're doing pretty well. The island of Java is becoming uninhabitable, and they're moving the capital in a number of years. I can't remember when. We got long-term plans to move to a northern island. So, because a lot of Java is underwater for like weeks at a time. So,
Yeah.
not Java, but Jakarta, the capital. So it's becoming. I mean, Jakarta is becoming increasingly unlivable, and that's the postcard example.
I remember reading about that. It's very rare for countries to move their capital, and I think Indonesia will be the first to do it in a really planned way as a result of a sort of long-term emergency with climate change. So kind of fascinating. It seems like they tried to mitigate as much as possible and prevent having to move it as much as possible. But eventually they're realizing that it's a really losing battle. Yeah. Moving back to a question from the audience. USAID helped rebuild Aceh, and that probably created more goodwill towards the US than military aid to the Indonesian government would have. If we had, instead of helping rebuild Aceh after the tsunami, decided that we were going to help the government just like completely quash the rebellion. How can we do a better job from a foreign policy perspective and from a citizen advocacy perspective, convincing politicians that humanitarian aid is a good use and maybe even a better way of spending taxpayer money?
Ooh, yeah. Right, Congresswoman, Congress. It's tough because selling foreign assistance was easy in this case, but this was the exception. So basically, it's just a matter of convincing folks, Americans, that it's a good investment. And not that many people in Congress do that with their constituents. They may well be very much in favor of foreign aid, but they kind of view it as a tool in the toolbox for getting things done, rather than garnering support in a host country. So I don't have any easy answers. It just, we need, that's why it's a good to highlight examples like this and make it known that where the U.S. was successful. But most of the work we do in foreign assistance is kind of day-to-day, basics, nuts and bolts stuff, not this high profile, reforming your agricultural practices or the education sector, or, making, the health system more efficient. That stuff isn't sexy and high profile. So I don't know. I mean, I worked for USAID for 30 years, and it was an octopus with tentacles everywhere, doing everything. And on any one thing, you may support it, but we were just, in some ways, trying to do everything everywhere. So not focusing and concentrating enough. And the good thing that this taught us was that after the tsunami, we had American leadership decided this is what we're going to do, and get on board or go home. So they made it for the decisions for the right reasons, and it worked out. So most of the time that doesn't happen. It's just U.S. It just underscores the importance for U.S. leadership, I guess. Thinking about it, and that's why I talked. My theme running through this presentation was U.S. leadership, and we had it from the top down, and it worked pretty well. I mean, I was kind of mid-level cog in it, but I witnessed it, and I saw that what U.S. leadership meant, and was able to accomplish. So that's why it's important, for good leaders. I think I'll quit there.
Yeah. I think it is a really hard sell right now in the current political climate. I mean, even Whereas maybe under some previous administrations, there was not even a lot of pushback to military assistance and to a lot of different countries. We're now even seeing pushback to military assistance,
Yeah.
at least in some places.
Yeah.
And so I think foreign aid of any kind in general is becoming an increasingly hard political sell with sort of isolationist or nationalist politicians that are seeming to gain a lot of traction. We can turn back to for a moment to the recent elections in Indonesia. I think I appreciated you mentioning that. I want to push a little bit more. You did mention that the president-elect is certainly another sort of strongman type, even if democratically elected, likely to be sort of quasi-authoritarian. Do you see him as sort of a threat to democracy in Indonesia? Even, previous strongmen have, to various degrees, sort of respected democratic institutions. They've just been sort of, I guess, vicious could be a word. Is he just a vicious democratic leader? Or is he an authoritarian in waiting? You mentioned that he was alleged to have participated in some pretty bad human rights abuses. He was actually banned from traveling to the US. I don't know if that is still in place or not because of those allegations.
Well, he traveled to the US after that happened under the previous US administration. The Trump administration allowed him in the US for some reasons.
Yeah. So, ban probably not in effect anymore. I don't think Biden reinstated it probably. That doesn't speak well for US Indonesia relationships. I think it's also kind of I'm just throwing some information at you that I learned sort of in the build up to this. Several of the victims of his human rights abuses have come out and have worked for his campaign and have come out and said, he's moved to the middle. And that's just really, that's weird to me, or from my perspective, but I don't have an insider's view to Indonesian politics at all. So could you tell us a little bit more about him and the implications for the relationship with the US, what you think he's going to govern like, or any other information, speculation you can provide on that?
It's interesting that, folks now support him. But, Indonesians, I don't mean to generalize about all Indonesians, but it's kind of what I'm doing. As a whole, they're very forgiving people, and they're very peaceful, and they just kind of want to give them a chance. And at the same time, the Indonesians long for stability, and they realize they need somebody to hold the country together. And so maybe he was viewed as the lesser of other evils, and that they didn't trust any of the others to hold the country together. Whereas there's no doubt this guy can. The hope is that he won't do it brutally. I really don't think that he would do that. I mean, it's a different era from when, the dictatorship of Sukarno and Suharto had their way. And also the dynamic in the region is such that a lot of Indonesians look to the U.S. as a role model. And, they want to be part of the international economy. And they're not looking at the Chinese or anybody else. So I think that will help tether the ability of the new president to get too wacky. But it's hard to really know. But the Indonesians, the country, is pretty resilient. And if I had a bet, I'd bet in favor of them getting through this and doing okay. But it's all TBD, to be determined. So, but I think I'm not too worried. I'm concerned, yes, but a lot of places I'm concerned with that are even closer to home.
Thank you. Yeah, so one additional question from the audience. We're getting low on time, so audience, if there are any more questions you have, please get them in the Q&A box. We've got time for maybe one or two more before we wrap up. Did you have any interaction with President Obama over Indonesia or work that you did there at any point?
No, I mean, his, yeah, no, because I was gone by then. No.
Okay. Well, we are out of questions from the audience, and you've already talked about shifts between China and the US spheres of influence and the elections, probably about as much as I feel comfortable pushing you to do. So I appreciate your candor and your expertise. I'm going to wrap up real quick, and then I'll throw it back to you for any big picture takeaways or any lasting things you'd like us to leave today with. Want to remind everybody that the Great Decision Speakers and other programs like this are only possible through the sponsorship of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, a 501c3 nonprofit that relies on donations and memberships to exist and put on these programs. So please, again, help them celebrate their 75th anniversary and become a member today. There are a variety of membership types available for a variety of different budgets, institutional memberships, individual memberships, student memberships. So please consider joining today. I want to thank you once again, Tom, for your time, your expertise, and your willingness to engage. This was incredibly informative. I just got a note in the chat. Thanks for an excellent informative program. Really appreciate you. I know I speak for the audience as well when we say that. I'll throw it over to you. Is there any sort of big picture takeaways, last words, all on you, Tom?
Yeah, I guess I got two, one inward looking and another one outward looking. Inward looking is that leadership is important, and U.S. leadership is important in the world. A lot of the countries in the world are looking for U.S. leadership, whether it's Ukraine or anywhere else. They want U.S. leadership, and they respect U.S. leadership for the most part. Other countries have lead roles in the world, but even now, with all of our problems, the U.S. is regarded as a leader. And in the case of Indonesia, Aceh, we exerted U.S. leadership in a timely and in a forceful manner for success. And, it came from the top down. So, and it can lead to success. So for everyone, that's one thing. The other thing is the Indonesians, as I was mentioned earlier, I indicated that I have faith in the Indonesians and I have faith in Indonesia. It's a resilient country. They're beautiful people, very peaceful, and for the most part. I mean, there's been some issues, but all countries have their issues. And they just really want to be part of the world. And they've suffered a lot, and they bounced, through it. I mean, the Dutch colonialists they really did a number on Indonesia. So they make the British look like saints. And they got through that, and then they were occupied by the Japanese, had a couple of dictatorships, and the country has come together. And now the challenges haven't gone away. Volcanoes everywhere you look, earthquakes because it's on the zone of fire, but they're chugging ahead. So I think that there's increasingly Indonesia is going to take a lead role in the world affairs and international institutions and international issues. And with any luck, the new president could lead that. So again, I know it's an overused term, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom.
That's it.
Thank you to you. Thank you to our audience. And thank you to our sponsors for helping us put on these great programs. Really appreciate the questions that came in from the audience. And once again, Tom, really appreciate you. Everyone have a great afternoon, and I hope to see you next time at the next event.
Thanks, Stephen. Looking forward to in the future being part of your team. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.